All right, let's take a look at Greek philosophy as part of our classical civilizations review of Greek civilization. We're going to start off by not looking at this. This is Socrates, or what we should really know as Socrates. A lot of people know this scene from Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure and think that somehow the examination of what they call Socrates is a good review of classical Greek civilization. Although funny, it's not quite what we're going to be looking at. We're going to look at actually who Socrates was and what he was really all about. Alright, so let's take a look at what we know. We know this. We know that Socrates wrote no books. So there are actually historical accounts that tell us things about Socrates in literature, but essentially he wrote nothing. So we don't have any of his own words that he might have written down and preserved. What we do know about him comes from Plato, his student. So his most famous student, Plato, a great philosopher in his own right, is the person who tells us the stories of Socrates and tells us what Socrates went through. So everything that we do know about Socrates comes to us through Plato. In fact, there are some historians that have argued that in many ways Socrates may not have been an actual person. He may have actually been a sort of literary creation of Plato's mind, so that Plato could say and discuss the sorts of issues that he wanted to without himself getting in trouble. And so he uses Socrates as a character to sort of say the things he wished he could really have said. Other people have said that actually Socrates really existed because he shows up in other literary sources as well. So it's hard to tell. Okay, this is what we do know about Socrates from these writings, and that is that he questioned fellow citizens about their beliefs. So he was very good at this. He often questioned them about their traditional beliefs, their religious beliefs, their values about bringing up youth or education, but he was always questioning people. He was always full of questions. He used what we call the Socratic method, and the Socratic method is that simple task of asking questions. So, somebody asks you, why was that important? You give an answer, and then they say, why? Your answer is probably discussed at some length, but again, he'll ask why, always asking why. This might be a very good strategy that teachers still use today of asking students questions about why to explain themselves, but also it can become quite annoying. And in fact, in some ways, Socrates may not have only questioned the local people in his community, but he may begin to have annoyed them by always asking them why and always asking them to defend their positions on why they stood where they did on their answers. Okay, so as a result, trial of Socrates takes place. That's because Socrates angered enough of the citizens of Athens that they decided that they would put him on trial. So at age 70, he was put on trial. He had a jury of 501 citizens, and the charge that he was charged with was basically corrupting the city's youth, and in particular, encouraging them to disrespect the gods. So again, he was questioning traditional values of their society, their religious beliefs, and in many ways even their political beliefs as well, perhaps things like democracy. And so as a result, he was put on trial, and he was eventually found guilty. And so Plato tells us about the death of Socrates. During this trial, he was found guilty, and he was in fact forced to drink hemlock. That was his punishment. And he, in the story, willingly drinks the hemlock. It's sort of his last attempt to sort of say to society he's going to get in the last word. In fact, he's at one point in the story, Plato tells us that his jailers actually leave the door unlocked so that he would actually leave his imprisonment and perhaps maybe go out to the countryside where he would be ostracized and sort of an outcast from society, but he doesn't. Instead, he chooses to stay behind and drink the hemlock to make his last and final point of the sort of injustice imposed against him upon society. Alright, so let's take a look at Plato. Here's Plato. He was, of course, Socrates' most famous student and is the person that tells us much about Socrates' life. But Plato himself emphasized reason, so he focused on ethics, beauty, and on what he believed was the ideal society. And interestingly, he was very suspicious of democracy, so he was not pro-democracy. He did not see democracy as a positive aspect of Athenian society. And so what he did was he wrote a book. He wrote a book called The Republic. And in The Republic, he sort of outlines what he believes to be the ideal state. And for him, it looks something like this. There will be three classes in this ideal state. At the top were philosophers, ruled by a philosopher king, followed by a soldier class, which supported those philosophers, and then the rest of the society was made up of the workers, the people that basically made the society function. And interestingly, within this sort of three-tiered society, women could participate, so women were seen as a significant component of that social system. Keep in mind, we're not just a democracy in America, but we're also a republic. The Romans would take the definition of republic as Plato outlined it to its full extent, and we are inheritors not only of Greek democracy from Athens, but also the Roman concept of republic, which really has its origins with Plato's concept of the republic itself. Right. Plato also set up a school. It was called the Academy. And this was basically a school where he basically taught his own ideas. He had his own following of students like Socrates did, and he was able to sort of share his ideas with those students and help spread his concept of republic and idealism and the idea of harmony and philosophical balance. Then there was Aristotle. Aristotle was a student of Plato's. He was also suspicious of democracy, and so he favored a single strong leader. Ironically, he would also become the teacher to Alexander the Great, the man who would go on to basically rule most of the world during what we call the Hellenistic time period. Now, Aristotle also promoted what we call the golden mean, which means that you should sort of approach things in moderation. Do all things in moderation, nothing to excess. And also he used reason as the guiding force for learning. And Aristotle would become the greatest sort of scientific, philosophical thinker of the ancient world and would be admired by everybody from not only the Greeks, the Romans, and even the Islamic world, but even some of the early sort of Renaissance scientists who wouldn't really question many of the ideas of Aristotle until really the 13th through maybe 15th centuries. So his impact was fairly great on human society and learning. Aristotle also had his own school. His school was known as the Lyceum, and it was actually considered the first university. And basically it was a school where people studied politics, ethics, logic, biology, literature, and physics. And this picture here is a famous picture painted by the Renaissance artist Raphael, known as the School of Athens. And it's supposed to represent Aristotle's sort of Lyceum, or maybe even Plato's own school as well. And as a result of that, it sort of represents the tradition of the Greek philosophers and Greek philosophy on the impact of Western Europe later on during the Renaissance.